In the quiet fields of 18th-century England, where sheep grazed under open skies and villages clung to the rhythm of seasons, a storm was brewing, not of thunder or wind, but of machines and smoke, of invention and ambition. It began not with a roar, but with the turn of a wheel, the hiss of steam and the spark of an idea. The world was changing, and at the heart of this transformation stood the English-speaking world, led by Britain and later joined by America, Canada, and other nations. Bound by language and law and the relentless drive to remake the world in their image, the Industrial Revolution did not arrive all at once, nor was it born from a single mind. It was a chain reaction, sparked by necessity and nurtured by possibility. It began in textiles with the spinning jenny and the water frame machines that multiplied human effort and redefined productivity. Cloth that once took weeks to produce now rolled out in days, then hours, powered by streams and soon by steam. The textile mills of Manchester, Leeds, and Birmingham became the beating heart of a new economy, one driven not by land and lineage, but by coal, iron, and enterprise. The countryside changed as farmers were pushed from their land by enclosure laws and lured into the cities by wages and promises. They arrived by the thousands, trading green fields for gray factories, quiet cottages for crowded tenements, and the steady pace of sun and season for the relentless tick of the factory clock. The English. Cities swelled with people and soot and ambition. Streets once lined with cobblestones and market stalls became avenues of industry, lined with chimneys, warehouses, and rail tracks here amid the clatter of looms and the whistle of steam engines. A new society was being forged, one shaped by capital, not class, by invention, not inheritance. As the mills multiplied, so too did the machines. Inventors like James Watt perfected the steam engine, turning heat and pressure into motion and motion. Into power factories no longer needed rivers to run. They could now rise anywhere coal could be carted in and water boiled, and so they did, spreading across Britain like wildfire, transforming towns into cities and regions into industrial giants. In the coal mines of Wales, in the shipyards of Glasgow, in the ironworks of Sheffield, men and boys toiled in darkness and danger, fueling the engines of empire. Their labor built the bridges, the rails, the tools and towers that marked the dawn of a new age. Yet the revolution was not merely mechanical, it was intellectual, social, and cultural. It changed how people lived, where they lived, how they worked, what they earned, what they dreamed of. It shattered the old world and forced its people to imagine a new one. For some, it brought wealth and power. A merchant who once traded wool by the bale could now build an empire of mills and machines. A banker in London could invest in railways stretching to the edge of empire. Fortunes were made in iron, steel, coal, and cotton, and a new class of industrial capitalists rose to rival the old aristocracy. For others, the change was harsher. Factory workers lived in squalor, inhaling smoke and spinning lint, suffering long hours for meager pay. Women and children labored alongside men, their hands nimble, their backs bent, their rights nearly non-existent. Diseases spread in cramped alleys and polluted air, and the gap between rich and poor widened with every clanging gear and rising chimney. Yet even amid the suffering, a new spirit stirred. Reformers demanded change, unions took root, writers chronicled the grit and grief of industrial life. Poets mourned the loss of green England, while visionaries saw in steam and steel the seeds of progress and freedom for the English-speaking world. The Industrial Revolution became a badge of pride and proof of power. It was proof that human ingenuity could conquer nature, time and distance that coal and steam could drive not only engines, but empires. As factories rose in England, so too did the ships that carried their goods across oceans, feeding markets in the Americas, Asia, and Africa, and drawing the world into a web of commerce and command that stretched from the mills of Manchester to the markets of Calcutta, from the ports of Liverpool to the rail yards of Chicago. And thus the Industrial Revolution did more than transform England. It set the English-speaking world on a path of global influence, a path paved with iron and ambition, and lit by the fires of invention. As the engines roared and factories multiplied, the revolution that began in Britain leapt across the Atlantic carried by ships, ideas, and ambition. The United States, still young and restless, embraced industrialization. With open arms and eager hands, what had begun in English mills soon took root in American soil, where rivers ran swift and untamed, and where cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York pulsed with energy and opportunity. American inventors, engineers, and entrepreneurs took inspiration from their British counterparts, but sought to build bigger, faster, more efficiently. The cotton gin created by Eli Whitney in the late 18th century transformed Southern agriculture by making the separation of cotton fibers from seeds quick and profitable. It also deepened the tragic dependence on enslaved labor, a contradiction at the heart of a nation built on liberty, yet addicted to exploitation in the North. Meanwhile, textile mills sprouted along, rivers and streams drawing young women from farms to labor in what became known as factory towns. The Lowell system in Massachusetts created entire communities around mills, offering work wages and a regimented lifestyle that shaped the American industrial worker. In Britain, the revolution had begun with textiles, but in America it quickly expanded to encompass iron railroads, and eventually oil and steel inventors like Robert Fulton and Samuel Morse ushered in new eras of transportation and communication. The steamboat tamed the great rivers, while the telegraph shortened the time it took for information to travel across the vast expanse of the continent. As in Britain, cities became the engines of growth, drawing millions from the countryside and from across the sea. Immigrants poured into American ports, fleeing poverty, famine, and oppression in their homelands, and finding work in the factories and foundries of the industrial cities they brought with them. New languages, faiths, customs, and dreams, all of which blended and collided in the crowded tenements and smoky skies of New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh in both Britain and America. The rise of industry reshaped class and culture. A new working class emerged, forged in the fires of labor struggle and urban life. They worked long hours for little pay in dangerous conditions, but they also formed communities, built neighborhoods, and gave rise to movements that would change history. Labor unions, strikes, protests, and reforms became part of the industrial landscape as workers demanded fair wages, safer conditions, and dignity in their work. The middle class also expanded, with clerks, shopkeepers, teachers, and professionals finding new roles in a society increasingly driven by commerce and consumption. Education became more valued as skills and literacy were needed for new kinds of work, and public schools began to spread, offering the promise of upward mobility through learning. The elite, too, transformed, no longer limited to landowners and nobles. The new industrial bourgeoisie drew their power from factories, banks, railroads, and trade networks. They built mansions, funded universities, and shaped politics, using their wealth to influence the direction of both nations. Yet the benefits of the revolution were unevenly shared. While London and New York gleamed with progress, many workers lived in squalor. While industrialists amassed fortunes, slums grew around factories, and pollution blackened the skies. The price of progress was high, measured not only in soot and sweat, but in broken bodies and lives lost to machines and disease. Yet even amid the hardship, the world was undeniably changing faster than ever before. New inventions poured forth. From workshops and laboratories, the sewing machine, the typewriter, the electric light, and eventually the telephone transformed daily life, making it easier, faster, more connected. The railroad became a symbol of this age, uniting distant cities, shrinking time and distance, forging nations into integrated markets and cultures. In Canada, too, the revolution spread, though more slowly and unevenly. The vast distances and rugged terrain made industrialization a challenge. Yet cities like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver began to grow, fueled by timber railways and immigration. The Canadian Pacific Railway became a symbol of national unity and economic ambition, linking east to west and opening the interior to settlement and development across the English-speaking world, the Industrial Revolution, brought both opportunity and upheaval. It created new wealth, but also new kinds of poverty. It expanded freedom for some while tightening the chains on others. It connected the world while dividing it along lines of class, race, and power. It was a time of great invention and great inequality, a time when the English-speaking world began to reshape not only its own destiny, but that of the entire planet through the power of industry, coal and steam, steel and ambition. The Industrial Revolution did not just change how goods were made, it transformed how people thought, how they moved, and how they understood the world. It redefined time as workers now lived by the factory bell. Rather than the sun and seasons, it redefined space as railways and telegraphs collapsed distances and brought people and ideas together faster than ever before. In Britain, trains carried passengers across the country in hours, not days, uniting once distant towns into a network of trade culture and influence stations rose like cathedrals of speed, grand arches of iron and glass, symbolizing the triumph of industry over nature. Canals gave way to railways, horse carts to steam engines, walking to cycling, and eventually to motorized vehicles in America. The railroad became the backbone of expansion, driving the growth of cities, transporting goods from coast to coast, and allowing people to chase opportunity into the farthest corners of the frontier. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 symbolized a new era of national unity, economic potential, and global power, even as it came at great cost to indigenous peoples and immigrant laborers whose sacrifices were often erased from history. The industrial transformation touched every part of life. Homes once lit by candles now glowed with gas and later electric lights. Water pumps and indoor plumbing brought convenience and sanitation. New machines for cooking, heating, and cleaning changed domestic roles, especially for women whose labor in the home had once consumed every waking hour. Education was reimagined as the need for a literate and skilled workforce grew public. Schools expanded and state involvement in learning increased, creating a generation shaped not only by their parents but by their nations. Libraries, museums, and reading rooms opened their doors to the public, driven by the idea that knowledge should be shared, and that progress required informed citizens in the English-speaking world. This democratization of learning became a defining feature with countries like Britain, America, and Canada, leading efforts to educate their people and prepare them for the demands of a changing world. Universities, expanded technical institutes were created, and the idea of lifelong learning began to take root in cities. Newspapers flourished, fueled by literacy and the printing press, informing workers, merchants, and leaders alike of events, inventions, and debates. Factories and offices became places not just of labor but of news, conversation, and sometimes resistance. Industrialization also transformed communication. The invention of the telegraph, and later the telephone, allowed messages to travel at the speed of thought, shrinking empires and allowing governments, businesses, and families to connect across continents in moments. This interconnectedness began to shape politics, culture, and commerce as the English-speaking world found itself at the center of a new global network. The British Empire, with its colonial reach and naval supremacy, used this connectivity to manage its vast holdings and expand its trade. America, meanwhile, used it to build markets, dominate industries, and project power abroad. Technology became both a tool and a symbol of power. It was proof of progress, evidence of superiority, and a justification for expansion and control. Industrial societies began to see themselves as more advanced, more rational, and more deserving of leadership over others. This mindset, known as the civilizing mission, became a key part of imperial ideology, justifying colonial rule as a benevolent effort to bring industry, education, and enlightenment to the so-called uncivilized parts of the world. But this ideology masked exploitation. Resources were extracted from colonies. Labor was forced or underpaid, local industries were undermined, and resistance was often brutally suppressed. Yet the story of the Industrial Revolution is not one of villains and victims alone. It is a story of complexity, of ambition, and survival of individuals and communities navigating a world that was being reinvented around them. Inventors, like Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Edison, became celebrities known not just for their inventions, but for how they symbolized the age of innovation. Workers formed unions, demanded rights, and redefined what it meant to labor writers like Charles Dickens and Upton Sinclair exposed the human cost of progress, stirring the conscience of the public and pushing for change. Reformers and philanthropists sought to improve housing, health, and education, seeing in the new industrial society both peril and potential. And amid the smoke and steel, there was also art, music, literature, and love cities became centers of culture as well as commerce, filled with theaters, galleries, cafes, and public spaces where the new urban population could gather. Reflect and express. The Industrial Revolution brought new burdens but also new freedoms, new fears but also new dreams. And in the English-speaking world, these contradictions played out on a global stage, influencing not only what people did, but who they believed they were and who they wanted to become. By the late 19th century, the momentum of the Industrial Revolution had carried the English-speaking world into an era of unprecedented growth, urbanization, and global influence. Cities that had once been market towns were now sprawling metropolises, humming with machines, alive with commerce, and crowned by smokestacks that reached for the sky. London, New York, Toronto, and Melbourne became symbols of industrial might, each with their own character shaped by geography, history, and the pulse of production. This new urban world was both dazzling and daunting. It offered jobs, electricity, entertainment, and education, but it also brought overcrowding, pollution, poverty, and class conflict. In Britain, slums grew alongside mansions, rail lines cut through neighborhoods, and factories operated day and night. The gap between the wealthy and the working class became more visible, more painful, and more politically explosive. Industrialization had promised progress, but it did not deliver it evenly. Reformers, writers, and revolutionaries began to challenge the systems that allowed a few to thrive while many toiled in misery. Trade unions grew stronger. Workers marched in protest, and politicians began to pass laws aimed at improving labor conditions, limiting child labor, mandating education, and addressing health concerns. These reforms were hard-won, born of struggle and sacrifice, but they marked a turning point in the industrial age. A growing belief that society had a responsibility to protect its most vulnerable, and that progress must be paired with justice in America too. Industrial expansion sparked both pride and protest. The Gilded Age saw immense wealth accumulated by figures like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Vanderbilt, whose empires in steel, oil, and railroads reshaped the landscape and set the stage for modern capitalism. Yet beneath the glittering surface lay sweatshops, tenements, strikes, and corruption. The labor movement surged forward from the coal fields of Pennsylvania to the meatpacking plants of Chicago, fighting for fair wages, safe conditions, and dignity at work. Immigrants continued to flow into American cities, drawn by the promise of opportunity. And shaped by the realities of factory life, their cultures, languages, and traditions added richness to the national fabric. Even as they faced discrimination and hardship across the English-speaking world, a new awareness was taking hold. The Industrial Revolution was not just a series of machines or inventions, it was a transformation of society, and with that transformation came questions about values, identity, and future direction. The rise of socialism, the spread of education, the growth of mass media, and the expanding role of government all pointed to a world in flux where old hierarchies were being questioned and new possibilities imagined. Technological innovation continued at a rapid pace. The internal combustion engine, the electric grid, the telephone, the typewriter, and eventually the airplane expanded human capability and reshaped daily life. Factories became more efficient, transportation more accessible, communication more immediate. The world was shrinking, and the English-speaking nations stood at the center of this new reality. Universities, research institutions, and Industrial labs became engines of discovery, pushing the boundaries of science and engineering and fueling further growth. Colonies, too, were drawn deeper into the orbit of industrial power, providing raw materials, markets, and labor for the factories of Britain, and its kin railways were laid across India, mines opened in Africa, plantations expanded in the Caribbean, and factories emerged in port cities across the empire. The Industrial Revolution in the English-speaking world became a global system, feeding off distant lands and shaping distant lives, not always to their benefit. Yet within this imperial structure, seeds of resistance were sown. Local leaders, intellectuals, and workers began to challenge colonial exploitation, inspired by the same ideas of progress, freedom, and justice that industrial societies claimed as their own. The contradictions of empire grew sharper, even as the factories hummed and the cities sparkled, and while these tensions simmered, the industrialized, English-speaking world began to look toward the future, toward electric lights on every street corner, cars on every road, radios in every home, skyscrapers touching the clouds, and dreams of invention that knew no bounds. This was a time of motion, a time of transformation, a time when the children of farmers became engineers, when women stepped into roles once denied to them, when the very rhythm of life changed to match the heartbeat of machines, and the world, though still marked by inequality, division, and struggle, seemed full of promise and possibility. The Industrial Revolution had set the stage for the modern age, and the English-speaking world was ready to step into it with all the ambition and complexity that history had forged into its soul. As the 20th century dawned, the legacy of the Industrial Revolution in the English-speaking world was both visible and invisible. It was in the steel bridges and electric lights in the schools and factories, and it was in the habits of thought and expectation that had taken root in every industrialized mind. Progress was no longer a hope. It was a demand. People believed in growth, in invention, in the power of machines and markets to lift nations and shape destiny. The cities of Britain, America, Canada, Australia, and beyond stood as monuments to the age of industry, their skylines dotted with smokestacks, their streets alive with commerce, their institutions formed by the needs and challenges of a mechanized world. Yet the revolution was far from over. It evolved with each new generation, and with it the English-speaking world continued to transform. Technology raced ahead with automobiles, assembly lines, airplanes, and eventually computers and satellites. The early achievements of coal and steam gave way to oil, electricity, and eventually digital power and nuclear energy. The nature of work began to change again as machines became smarter and faster, and workers moved from factory floors to office buildings, from mines to laboratories, from mills to computer terminals and call centers. The foundation laid by the Industrial Revolution supported the next wave of global transformation, one built on information communication and automation. Still, the deeper changes were not only technological, they were social, political, and cultural. Women who had long been part of the industrial workforce began demanding equal rights and opportunities. The suffrage movement that had taken root in industrial cities turned into a broader fight for justice and recognition. People of all backgrounds began to challenge the limitations imposed by class, race, gender, and geography. The English-speaking world found itself wrestling with the contradictions it had inherited. From the industrial age, freedom and inequality, wealth and poverty, innovation and exploitation. As the 20th century unfolded, wars and depressions tested the structures that industrialization had built. The First and Second World Wars showed both the power and peril of industrial might as factories turned to weapons production and cities became targets of mechanized destruction. The Great Depression revealed the fragility of economies built on mass production and consumption. Yet out of these crises came new resolve and innovation. Governments took a greater role in managing economies, providing safety nets and supporting public services. Unions won hard-fought gains in wages, safety and labor rights, and international cooperation became more valued as nations sought to prevent another descent into chaos. Education expanded, healthcare improved, and the dream of a better life through work and ingenuity remained alive. The English-speaking world led in many of these efforts, drawing on its industrial heritage while trying to learn from its mistakes. The idea of progress remained, but it was now tempered by caution, by a recognition that not all advances bring justice and not all power brings peace. The revolution had taught the world how to build, how to grow, how to connect. Now, it had to learn how to balance, how to share, how to sustain in the post-war era new technologies like computers, televisions, and space travel. Once again, redefined society, industries shifted. From manufacturing to services, from manual labor to digital management, and once more the structure of daily life evolved, shaped by inventions and systems that few could have imagined. In the days of coal and steam, the environmental cost of industrialization became harder to ignore as pollution, climate change, and resource depletion threatened the very world that technology had helped transform. Movements for environmental justice, clean energy, and sustainable development began to rise alongside new industrial powers emerging in Asia and elsewhere. The English-speaking world no longer stood alone at the center of global progress, but its influence remained. Its institutions, values, technologies, and histories continued to shape the world stage. The Industrial Revolution had begun in the English countryside, had surged through American cities, had reached across continents and oceans, and had laid the foundation for the global civilization of today. It had changed how people worked, traveled, communicated, governed, and dreamed. It had expanded the possible while complicating the real, and its legacy lived on in every nation that built its future with the tools it had forged, in every community that remembered the cost and promise of change, in every person who believed that the world could be made better through knowledge, effort, and invention. From spinning jennies to smartphones, from steam engines to space stations, the journey of the English-speaking world through the Industrial Revolution was not just a chapter in history. It was the story of transformation itself, and though that revolution has passed, its echoes continue in the questions we ask, the choices we make, and the world we are still building. One invention, one idea, one life at a time.